The afternoon sun cast dappled shadows across the village green of St. Mary Mead as the annual midsummer garden fete reached its genteel crescendo. White marquees dotted the emerald lawn like scattered handkerchiefs, their canvas sides fluttering gently in the warm breeze. The air carried the mingled scents of fresh-baked scones, prize-winning roses, and the faint lavender water that Mrs. Dolly Bantry favored. Children's laughter punctuated the steady murmur of polite conversation, while the brass band from Much Benham provided a cheerful backdrop with their spirited rendition of popular melodies. Miss Jane Marple sat beneath the spreading branches of an ancient oak, her knitting needles clicking with practiced rhythm as she worked on what appeared to be another of her endless supply of baby blankets. Her keen blue eyes, though often mistaken for merely kindly, observed the familiar tableau with the attention of a naturalist studying specimens. She had attended this same fete for over 30 years, watching the ebb and flow of village life, the subtle shifts in relationships, the small dramas that played out beneath the veneer of rural respectability. The vicar, Reverend Stephen Clement, moved among his parishioners with characteristic warmth, his round face beaming as he sampled Mrs. Price's famous lemon-curd tart, and complimented young Tommy Simmons on his collection of pressed flowers. His wife, Griselda, presided over the white elephant stall with barely concealed impatience, her artistic temperament ill-suited to the endless parade of chipped teacups and outdated novels that constituted the afternoon's offerings. Near the coconut shy, Colonel Arthur Bantry engaged in animated discussion with Dr. Haydock about the declining standards of modern cricket, their voices carrying the authority of men accustomed to being heard. Mrs. Bantry, resplendent in a hat that defied both gravity and good taste, held court beside the jam stall, regaling a captive audience with her theories about the proper cultivation of delphiniums. Most intriguing to Miss Marple's practiced eye was Mr. Edmund Blacklock, the village's newest resident. He had purchased Dyer's Hall only 3 months prior, arriving from London with little fanfare and even less explanation for his sudden desire for country living. A man of perhaps 50, with the kind of unremarkable features that seemed designed to blend into crowds, he moved through the gathering with studied casualness. Yet Miss Marple had noticed how his gaze lingered on faces with the intensity of someone cataloguing details, and how his responses to innocent questions about his past carried the careful precision of a man who had rehearsed his answers. The fete proceeded with predictable rhythm until 3:30. When Mrs. Clement's voice rang out across the green with uncharacteristic shrillness. "Has anyone seen Professor Wainwright? He was meant to begin his lecture on village folklore and ancient mysteries." 10 minutes ago. Professor Marcus Wainwright, the retired academic who had settled in St. Mary Mead the previous autumn, was known for his punctuality as much as his encyclopedic knowledge of local history. His weekly lectures at the parish hall drew respectable crowds, and his scheduled talk at the fete had been advertised for weeks. The small gathering of eager listeners near the makeshift podium began to murmur with mild concern. Young Dr. Clement, the vicar's nephew and a recent addition to Dr. Haydock's practice, volunteered to search the professor's usual haunts. He returned within minutes, his face pale beneath his summer tan. "Uncle Stephen," he called, his voice carrying an odd tremor. "I think you'd better come. There's something rather peculiar." The crowd's attention shifted with the magnetic pull of potential drama. Miss Marple set aside her knitting with deliberate care, her instincts sharpened by decades of experience with human nature under stress. She noted how Mr. Blacklock's hand tightened almost imperceptibly on his walking stick, and how Mrs. Bantry's animated chatter ceased mid-sentence. Dr. Clement led a small procession toward the old summer house at the far end of the vicarage garden, a Victorian folly that had seen better days. The structure, with its peeling paint and ivy-covered walls, was rarely visited except by adventurous children seeking hideaways. As they approached, the cheerful sounds of the fete seemed to fade, replaced by an oppressive silence that made even the birds cease their singing. Inside the summer house, Professor Wainwright sat slumped in a wicker chair, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled, his spectacles askew. His notebook lay open on the small table beside him, the pages covered with his characteristic precise handwriting. But it was the expression on his face that sent a collective shiver through the assembled villagers, a look of profound shock and terror, as if he had seen something that challenged every rational belief he had ever held. Dr. Haydock, summoned by urgent whispers, made his way through the crowd with professional efficiency. His examination was brief but thorough, his face growing increasingly grave. When he finally looked up, his words fell like stones into the summer afternoon. "I'm afraid Professor Wainwright is dead. Natural causes by all appearances, but—" He paused, glancing at the notebook with obvious puzzlement. "Most extraordinary. It's as if he died of fright." Miss Marple's gaze swept the assembled faces, noting the subtle variations in their expressions of shock and concern. In her experience, death rarely visited without invitation, and even the most natural demise often concealed secrets that demanded illumination. The Midsummer Garden fate had become something altogether different, and she settled her shawl more securely around her shoulders, preparing for the investigation that would inevitably follow. The peaceful afternoon had been transformed into something far more sinister, and in the growing shadows of the summer evening, Miss Marple began to knit together the threads of observation that would, in time, reveal the truth. The gravity of Dr. Haydock's pronouncement settled over the assembled villagers like morning mist, transforming the cheerful afternoon into something altogether more ominous. Within moments, the news had rippled outward from the summer house, carried by hushed whispers and meaningful glances, until every remaining soul at the fete understood that Professor Wainwright was dead, and that his death bore the unsettling hallmark of profound terror. Miss Marple remained in her position beneath the oak, her knitting needles moving with automatic precision while her keen eyes catalogued the subtle shifts in behavior that death invariably provoked. Mrs. Bantry, abandoning her usual theatrical flourishes, pressed a trembling hand to her throat and spoke in genuine, subdued tones to anyone who would listen. Colonel Bantry assumed the bearing of a man accustomed to crisis, directing the dispersal of curious onlookers with military efficiency. Most intriguing to Miss Marple's practiced observation was Mr. Blacklock, who had withdrawn into himself with the practiced ease of someone more comfortable observing than participating, his eyes moving constantly among the villagers with an intensity that suggested more than casual interest. The arrival of Inspector Slack from Much Benham brought official procedure to the proceedings, though Miss Marple suspected his methods would prove as heavy-handed as usual. She had encountered the inspector on previous occasions and found his tendency to seize upon the most obvious explanation, both predictable and frequently misguided. True to form, he immediately began questioning the circumstances with characteristic bluntness. "Natural causes, you say, Doctor?" Inspector Slack addressed Dr. Haydock with barely concealed impatience. "Heart failure, something of that nature?" "The symptoms are consistent with cardiac arrest," Dr. Haydock replied with medical caution, but the expression on his face suggests something rather more dramatic, as if he had received a profound shock, something that frightened him quite literally to death. This observation prompted renewed speculation among the remaining villagers. The theories multiplied with the peculiar velocity that accompanies unexpected tragedy in small communities. Mrs. Price, clutching her lemon-curd tart, whispered that perhaps the professor had encountered something supernatural during his research into local ghost stories. The vicar, while diplomatically avoiding contradiction, gently reminded the gathering that Professor Wainwright had been a man of science, unlikely to succumb to superstitious fears. "He was always poking about in old documents," remarked Mr. Pye, the village grocer, "talking about some ghostly presence in the village archives. Perhaps he found what he was looking for." Miss Marple found herself drawn to the professor's notebook, which remained open beside his chair. From her vantage point, She could observe the neat handwriting that covered the visible pages, though the specific content remained frustratingly illegible. The notebook appeared filled with research notes, sketches of local landmarks, and what looked like genealogical charts connecting various village families across generations. Inspector Slack's examination of the notebook proved characteristically superficial. He flipped through the pages with obvious disinterest, pausing only when he encountered a loose photograph tucked between the leaves. The yellowed image showed Victorian-era villagers posed before the old church, with several faces circled in red ink and notations in the professor's precise script. "Local history research," the inspector announced dismissively. Nothing suspicious about a retired academic pursuing his hobbies. Young Tommy Simons, flushed with importance at being questioned by official authority, provided the afternoon's most intriguing revelation. "I saw the professor go into the summer house, sir," he piped up eagerly. "And there was a lady at the door. I couldn't see her face proper because of her hat, but it was grey with a little veil." This testimony produced a collective intake of breath among the assembled villagers. Inspector Slack's expression suggested he found the detail more irritating than illuminating. "Hat," he repeated with obvious skepticism. "Grey with a veil. Could have been anyone." Miss Marple, whose experience encompassed veils and their various purposes, considered how many faces could be rendered unrecognizable by the merest net. She noted the quick interest that flared in Griselda Clement's eyes and the careful stillness that settled over Mr. Blacklock, like a pond going flat when disturbed. As the official proceedings continued, Miss Marple observed the subtle adjustments people made under stress. Young Dr. Clement squared his shoulders as if wishing to appear useful and calm. Mr. Blacklock made several attempts to examine the professor's notebook more closely, each time being diplomatically redirected by the constable. Most telling of all was the way certain villagers seemed almost relieved beneath their expressions of shock, as if the professor's death had resolved some unspoken concern. Dr. Haydock, walking beside Miss Marple as the gathering finally dispersed, seemed troubled by the afternoon's events. "Most peculiar business," he confided. "Marcus struck me as remarkably robust for a man of his years. This sudden collapse simply doesn't align with my observations of his general health." "Indeed, Doctor," Miss Marple replied thoughtfully. "And did you notice anything particular about his research? The notebook seemed quite extensively annotated." "That's precisely what concerns me most." He had been asking rather pointed questions lately about certain village families, their histories, their connections to past events, almost as if he were investigating something specific rather than simply satisfying academic curiosity. As they reached the garden gate, Miss Marple paused to consider the professor's final moments. A man of science, dying of apparent fright in a summer house where he had gone to collect his lecture notes. A mysterious woman in grey. A notebook filled with genealogical research and circled photographs. The pieces suggested a puzzle far more complex than Inspector Slack's dismissive assessment would allow. The implications hung between them in the gathering dusk, each lost in contemplation of what Professor Wainwright might have discovered, and whether that discovery had somehow sealed his fate. The morning after Professor Wainwright's death dawned with that peculiar quality of enforced normalcy that follows village tragedies, when ordinary routines attempt to reassert themselves over extraordinary circumstances. Miss Marple had risen earlier than usual, her sleep disturbed by thoughts of the professor's final expression and the mysterious woman in grey. From her cottage window, she observed the subtle alterations in her neighbor's morning patterns that death invariably produced. Mrs. Bantry emerged from her garden gate precisely 10 minutes earlier than her customary constitutional, her theatrical gestures replaced by the brisk efficiency of someone avoiding unwanted encounters. The vicar's morning rounds took him past the summer house twice, though Miss Marple noted he carefully avoided looking directly at the structure. Most intriguing was Mr. Blacklock, who appeared to be taking an unusual interest in his front garden, lingering with apparent purposelessness while maintaining an excellent view of the comings and goings along the village lane. By 9:30, Miss Marple had positioned herself in the post office queue, a location that afforded both excellent opportunities for observation and access to the village's most reliable source of information. Mrs. Hartwell, the postmistress, possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of local affairs and the diplomatic skills necessary to extract details while appearing merely conversational. "Such a terrible shock about poor Professor Wainwright," Mrs. Hartwell observed, while sorting the morning delivery with practiced efficiency. "Though I must say, he had been acting rather oddly these past few weeks, coming in here at all hours, asking about old records, wanting to know who might have family papers dating back 50 years or more. Most persistent about the Shawcross family he was." The Shawcross name produced a visible reaction among the other customers. Mrs. Price shifted uncomfortably while examining the selection of postcards, and young Dr. Clement, who had entered seeking stamps, paused in his transaction with obvious interest. "The Shawcrosses," Miss Marple repeated gently, her tone suggesting mild curiosity rather than intense interest. "I don't believe I recall that. Family name." "Before your time, dear, though not by much. They lived at Dyas Hall until the tragedy in 1879. The daughter, Miss Annabel Shawcross, disappeared under most mysterious circumstances. Some said she eloped, others whispered of worse fates. The family never recovered from the scandal and eventually sold the property." Dr. Clement completed his purchase with unusual haste, offering polite but brief acknowledgments before departing. Miss Marple filed this reaction away for future consideration while maintaining her expression of gentle interest. "How very distressing," she murmured. "And Professor Wainwright was researching this particular family?" "Oh yes, quite thoroughly. He had been corresponding with various record offices, even traveled to London twice in recent weeks. Said he was investigating what he called the ghost who never existed. Kept muttering about dates that didn't align and stories that contradicted the parish records." This revelation cast Professor Wainwright's death in an entirely different light. Miss Marple completed her postal business with appropriate deliberation, allowing the conversation to continue naturally while her mind processed the implications. A retired academic investigating a decades-old disappearance, dying of apparent fright after meeting with an unidentified woman in grey. The coincidence seemed rather too convenient for comfort. Her morning walk took her past the vicarage, where she encountered Griselda Clement tending to the roses with unusual vigor. The younger woman's typically animated demeanor had been replaced by distracted intensity that suggested preoccupation with matters beyond horticultural concerns. "Such beautiful blooms," Miss Marple observed, pausing at the garden gate, "though I notice you're cutting them rather severely." Griselda straightened with a startled expression, as if emerging from deep contemplation. "Oh, Miss Marple. Yes, well, they needed attention." She gestured vaguely at the rose bushes, which appeared perfectly healthy to Miss Marple's experienced eye. "I was just thinking about poor Professor Wainwright," Griselda continued, her voice carrying an odd note of forced casualness. "Such a scholarly gentleman, always so interested in local history and old family connections." Miss Marple noted the slight emphasis on family connections and filed it alongside her growing collection of interesting observations. "Indeed, I understand he had been researching the Shawcross family quite extensively." The reaction was immediate and telling. Griselda's pruning shears slipped, nearly catching her finger, and color drained from her cheeks before returning in a pronounced flush. "The Shawcrosses? I wouldn't know anything about that. Ancient history, surely." The denial came too quickly and with too much emphasis for complete credibility. Miss Marple maintained her pleasant expression while making mental notes about the younger woman's obvious discomfort with the subject. As she continued her walk, Miss Marple chose the path that skirted Dyer's Hall. Mr. Blacklock emerged from his front door with the studied casualness of someone who had been watching for her approach. "Miss Marple," he said with polished warmth, "a pleasure to see you. Dreadful business yesterday. One never expects such tragedy among the roses." One rarely expects it where it is most likely, Miss Marple replied gently. I hear Professor Wainwright had applied to examine your historical documents. A private collection, he returned without missing a beat. Not properly catalogued. I told him when it was organized properly. Then perhaps he seemed disappointed but surely understood the need for proper scholarly preparation. Miss Marple observed how his hand tightened almost imperceptibly on his walking stick. You were at the fete, Mr. Blacklock, and then you were not. I do hope you found the afternoon agreeable despite the unfortunate conclusion. He studied her with the calculating gaze of someone determining whether she was what she seemed. I developed a headache and walked home across the fields. One shouldn't disappear from village festivities, I suppose, but I am not yet entirely acclimatized to such social demands. As he spoke, Miss Marple noticed his quick glance toward the northeast corner of the house, where a narrow window protruded. The old map room, perhaps, where the Shawcross family papers might still reside. Walking home, she encountered Dr. Haydock near the village green. He looked troubled, his usual cheerful demeanor replaced by professional concern. I've been thinking about Marcus all night, he confided. The physical symptoms were consistent with extreme shock, but something troubles me. When I examined him more closely this morning, his pupils showed signs of profound adrenaline response. Whatever frightened him, it was immediate and overwhelming. The mind can be prepared for shock, Doctor, Miss Marple observed thoughtfully. If one expected to meet a ghost and instead encountered something far more earthly and threatening, the surprise might indeed prove fatal. She paused at her garden gate, her mind arranging the morning's revelations with characteristic precision. Professor Wainwright had been investigating the mysterious disappearance of Annabel Shawcross in 1879, convinced that the accepted story contained significant inaccuracies. His research had led him to believe in the ghost who never existed, suggesting that the Grey Lady legend associated with Dyas Hall was built upon false foundations. Someone had lured him to the summer house with the promise of proof, and that encounter had literally frightened him to death. The question remained whether the professor's death represented justice for past sins or merely the first move in a more complex and dangerous game. Miss Marple settled her shawl more securely around her shoulders, sensing that the peaceful village of St. Mary Mead was about to yield secrets that had been buried for far too long. Inspector Slack returned to St. Mary Mead the following morning with the determined efficiency of a man who believed that mysteries yielded to persistence rather than subtlety. Miss Marple observed his arrival from her cottage window, noting how his purposeful stride immediately attracted the attention of various villagers who found sudden reasons to tend their front gardens or examine their gate latches with unusual care. By noon, the inspector had established himself at the vicarage and begun what he termed a proper investigation into the circumstances surrounding Professor Wainwright's unfortunate demise. His first order of business involved a more thorough examination of the summer house, where he discovered several details that his initial cursory inspection had overlooked. Scuff marks on the flagstone threshold suggested someone had stood there for an extended period, and the interior arrangement of furniture indicated that the professor had not simply collapsed where he sat, but had moved toward the door before succumbing to his fatal shock. Miss Marple, arriving at the vicarage with a basket of preserves for Mrs. Clement, positioned herself where the open windows provided excellent acoustical advantages for those possessed of both sharp hearing and genuine concern for their neighbors' welfare. Inspector Slack's interview with young Tommy Simmons proved particularly illuminating, as the boy's memory, when properly encouraged, yielded additional details about the mysterious woman in gray. She smelled like my grandmother's sachets, Tommy reported with the earnestness of youth. Violets, but not fresh ones. The dried kind that ladies keep in their drawers to make things smell nice. This detail prompted Inspector Slack to examine the White Elephant stall more thoroughly, where Mrs. Bantry's sharp eyes had already detected an irregularity. There were 2 gray hats with veils yesterday morning, she informed the inspector with the authority of someone who had catalogued every donated item. Only one remained after luncheon, and no one recalls purchasing the missing one. Most peculiar, as the money tin showed no corresponding payment. The discovery of a torn fragment of grey veiling caught on a splinter of the stall's wooden frame provided the inspector with what he considered his first tangible clue. The netting was fine quality, with a narrow velvet edge that would have softened facial features without completely obscuring them. More significantly, Mrs. Bantry recalled seeing someone examining the hats with particular interest, a tall figure wearing thin grey gloves and a small silver brooch in the shape of a swallow. Inspector Slack's subsequent interview with Mr. Blacklock proceeded with the predictable courtesy extended to gentlemen of obvious education and social standing, though Miss Marple detected an underlying tension in the exchange. Blacklock confirmed his departure from the fete due to a sudden headache, his solitary walk across the fields, and his complete ignorance of any woman in grey who might have visited the vicarage grounds. Professor Wainwright had approached me about examining certain historical documents, Blacklock explained with careful precision. I explained that they required proper cataloguing before scholarly review. He seemed disappointed but appeared to accept my explanation with good grace. What struck Miss Marple as most significant was not what Mr. Blacklock said, but what he carefully avoided saying. His responses carried the rehearsed quality of someone who had anticipated such questions and prepared accordingly. Moreover, his hands, which had remained perfectly steady throughout the interview, betrayed a slight tremor when the inspector mentioned the Shawcross family name. Dr. Haydock's arrival at the vicarage provided additional perspective on the professor's final hours. "I've completed a more thorough examination," he informed Inspector Slack with professional gravity. "The cause of death was certainly cardiac arrest brought on by extreme shock, but there are details that suggest the encounter was more complex than a simple, frightening experience." The doctor's revelation that Professor Wainwright's clothing showed subtle signs of a struggle. Fabric caught on chair arms, his collar displaced, spectacles askew in a manner suggesting sudden movement, painted a picture of a man who had not simply collapsed from fear but had attempted to flee from whatever had terrified him. Most intriguingly, Dr. Haydock had discovered traces of an unusual perfume on the professor's jacket. "Something with bergamot and white jasmine," he reported. "Quite distinctive and certainly not a scent I associate with any of our local ladies." Inspector Slack seized upon these details with characteristic enthusiasm, constructing a theory that placed Mr. Blacklock at the center of the mystery. "The gentleman has the most to lose from historical investigations," he declared with satisfaction. "He refuses access to family papers, disappears during the crucial period, and has no credible witnesses to his whereabouts." Miss Marple, however, found herself increasingly skeptical of this obvious conclusion. Her experience had taught her that the most apparent suspect was often the least likely culprit, and Inspector Slack's eagerness to close the case suggested he was overlooking crucial subtleties. Her opportunity for more direct observation came when she encountered Griselda Clement in the village shop that afternoon. The younger woman's typically animated demeanor had been replaced by a distracted nervousness that manifested in dropped parcels and stammered responses to simple questions. Most tellingly, when Mrs. Hartwell mentioned that Professor Wainwright had been researching parish records dating back to 1879, Griselda's face drained of color so completely that Miss Marple feared she might faint. "Are you quite well, my dear?" Miss Marple inquired with gentle concern. "Perfectly fine," Griselda replied too quickly, her voice carrying an odd strain. "Just tired from all this dreadful business." As Miss Marple walked home through the lengthening shadows, she reflected on the day's revelations. Inspector Slack's focus on Mr. Blacklock, while logical, felt premature and potentially misguided. The physical evidence suggested careful planning rather than spontaneous action, and the mysterious woman in grey remained tantalizingly elusive despite the accumulating details about her appearance and behavior. Most significantly, the reactions of various villagers to questions about the Shawcross family suggested that Professor Wainwright's research had touched upon secrets that extended far beyond a single historical mystery. The truth, Miss Marple suspected, lay not in the obvious connections, but in the subtle patterns of behavior that revealed themselves only to those patient enough to observe and wise enough to understand the complexities of human nature under pressure. That evening brought the peculiar quiet that settles over villages when tragedy has disturbed the natural order of things. Miss Marple, after a modest supper of cold ham and fresh bread, tied on her walking bonnet and ventured out with the purposeful air of someone paying necessary calls. The lengthening shadows provided excellent cover for observation, and she had learned long ago that people revealed their truest selves in the hours following shock. Her first destination was Professor Wainwright's cottage, where a narrow thread of lamplight showed through the drawn curtains. Mrs. Finch, the professor's housekeeper, admitted her with the immediate relief of someone who desperately wished to speak but feared appearing indiscreet. "It isn't my place to gossip, Miss Marple," Mrs. Finch began, her hands worrying at a tea towel, but the professor had a visitor 2 days before his death. A lady from London, I believe. Very refined, with gloves too fine for country visiting and a small crystal bottle of scent that caught the light when she opened her reticule. Miss Marple murmured encouragingly, while noting the housekeeper's precise observation of details. Mrs. Finch had clearly been impressed by the visitor's sophistication. "The perfume was distinctive," Mrs. Finch continued, warming to her subject. "Jasmine and something sharp, like when you grate lemon peel for cooking." She wore a silver brooch shaped like a swallow, and when the professor showed her that old photograph of villagers by the church, she touched the brooch in the picture and laughed very quietly. After she left, he paced the floor talking to himself. "If it is true," he kept saying, "then the ghost never existed." This revelation cast Professor Wainwright's final day in an entirely different light. Miss Marple asked gently whether the lady had given her name. "Mrs. Gray," Mrs. Finch replied, reddening slightly at how obviously false it sounded. "I thought perhaps she preferred not to be known by her real name." On the professor's writing desk, Miss Marple noticed a square of blotting paper that had been turned face down. When Mrs. Finch absent-mindedly straightened it, the reverse showed the faintest impression of inked words written backward. "Summer House 4, bring brooch," and beneath it what appeared to be initials in a hurried scrawl. Miss Marple's next call took her to the church, where lamplight glowed in the vestry window. Reverend Clement was examining parish registers at Inspector Slack's request, his spectacles perched low on his nose as he conscientiously catalogued volumes. He welcomed Miss Marple's offer to assist with the more temperamental bindings, and she observed with interest how the 1879 register fell open to a frequently consulted page. 2 entries caught her attention immediately. The baptism of an Annabel S. in April showed slightly different ink and handwriting from the surrounding entries, while a burial in June was marked simply as "Infant of John Shawcross, name omitted." The alterations were subtle but unmistakable to someone familiar with the variations in 19th century record-keeping. Professor Wainwright believed these records had been tampered with. Reverend Clement explained quietly. He thought someone had tried to obscure the true circumstances of the Shawcross family tragedy. As they worked, Miss Marple detected a faint scent lingering in the vestry. Not the sharp jasmine Mrs. Finch had described, but something older and more powdery, like violet sachets left too long in drawers. The distinction seemed significant, suggesting 2 different presences rather than one. Leaving the church, Miss Marple encountered Mr. Blacklock walking among the headstones with studied casualness. His explanation about admiring old stones rang hollow, particularly when she noticed his quick, nervous glance toward the vestry window. "Did you know Professor Wainwright well?" she inquired gently. "Hardly at all," he replied too quickly, then more carefully. "He had the academic's curiosity about local history. It can be a dangerous habit when it uncovers things better left buried. The following morning brought Inspector Slack's return with renewed purpose and a theory that focused squarely on Griselda Clement. The inspector had discovered that she owned a silver swallow brooch and had admitted to wearing it at the fete before mysteriously losing it. More damaging still, Mrs. Bantry had recalled seeing someone examining the grey hats at the White Elephant stall, someone wearing fine grey gloves and a distinctive swallow brooch. When questioned privately, Griselda's composure cracked slightly. "I did not go to the summer house," she insisted with desperate intensity. "Someone sent me a note asking to borrow a grey hat for play acting. I thought it harmless and sent an old one. The note was unsigned but smelled faintly of an unfamiliar perfume." Miss Marple observed the interplay of scents with growing interest. Dr. Haydock had identified bergamot and jasmine on Professor Wainwright's jacket, while the vicarage carried the older fragrance of violet sachets. Two distinct perfumes suggested either two different women or one person deliberately creating multiple identities. That afternoon, Mrs. Bantry provided the final piece of the immediate puzzle. She had indeed seen someone near the hat stall wearing a swallow brooch identical to Griselda's, but the woman had kept her face carefully concealed. Most significantly, when Mrs. Bantry had returned to count the takings, one grey hat was missing without any corresponding payment in the money tin. Walking home through the gathering dusk, Miss Marple arranged these revelations with characteristic precision. Someone had borrowed Griselda's identity through the brooch and hat, used Mrs. Finch's description to establish credibility as Mrs. Gray, and carefully orchestrated Professor Wainwright's final meeting. The appointment at 4 o'clock in the summer house had been timed perfectly, when the fete was at its busiest and a missing hat would go unnoticed. The professor had expected to meet his mysterious London visitor and instead encountered someone who knew enough about the Shawcross family secrets to literally frighten him to death. The question remained whether this represented justice for past crimes, or merely the first move in a more complex and dangerous deception. Miss Marple pulled her shawl closer as she reached her garden gate, sensing that the peaceful village of St. Mary Mead was about to yield secrets that had been carefully buried for far too long. The morning after Inspector Slack's discovery of the duplicate brooch dawned with that peculiar quality of suspended animation that follows the collapse of seemingly solid theories. Miss Marple had risen earlier than usual, her mind occupied with the subtle distinctions between original and copy, truth and fabrication. The inspector's frustration with Griselda's adamant denial had created an opportunity for more thoughtful investigation, and she intended to make full use of it. Her first call took her to Professor Wainwright's cottage, where Mrs. Finch admitted her with obvious relief. The housekeeper had discovered something during her morning tidying that had left her thoroughly unsettled. "I know I shouldn't have touched his papers, Miss Marple," Mrs. Finch began apologetically. "But when I was dusting the study, I noticed the blotting paper had been turned face down. When I straightened it properly, I could see the impression of writing. Backward, of course, but clear enough if you held it to the light." The blotting paper revealed its secrets reluctantly. The words, "Summer House 4, bring brooch," appeared in the professor's careful script, along with what looked like hastily scrawled initials. Most significantly, the paper showed signs of having been pressed with unusual force, as if the writer had been agitated or emphatic about the message. "He received a visitor that final morning," Mrs. Finch continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Someone came while I was at market. When I returned, he was pacing the floor, muttering about appointments and evidence. He kept touching his waistcoat pocket, as if checking that something was still there." Miss Marple encouraged the housekeeper to describe any other changes she had noticed in the professor's behavior or possessions. The revelation that several pages had been torn from his research notebook, pages that Mrs. Finch remembered containing detailed genealogical charts, suggested that someone had attempted to remove specific evidence after his death. Her next destination was the vicarage, where she found Griselda Clement in a state of barely controlled distress. The younger woman's usual vivacity had been replaced by a nervous tension that manifested in dropped teacups and stammered responses to simple questions. "I must tell someone the truth," Griselda burst out when Miss Marple gently inquired about her well-being. "I did lend my brooch and a grey hat, but not to anyone I knew." A note came, very politely written, asking if I might assist with what they called a small theatrical jest for the fete. It seemed harmless, even rather charming. The note was unsigned but smelled faintly of violets, like the sachets my grandmother used. The distinction between the violet scent of the note and the bergamot jasmine perfume found on Professor Wainwright's clothing struck Miss Marple as highly significant. Two different women, or one person deliberately creating multiple identities through carefully chosen fragrances. "The brooch was my grandmother's," Griselda continued, her voice gaining strength. "She always said it had been in the family for generations, passed down through the female line. I thought someone had simply admired it and wanted to borrow it for costume purposes." Miss Marple's afternoon visit to the church vestry provided additional pieces to the puzzle. Reverend Clement, continuing his conscientious cataloguing of parish records, had discovered that the 1879 register showed signs of deliberate alteration. The page recording June burials had been carefully removed, leaving only the faintest evidence of its former presence. Professor Wainwright believed these records had been tampered with decades ago, the vicar explained quietly. He thought someone had tried to obscure the true circumstances of the Shawcross family tragedy by removing or altering key entries. The pattern that emerged suggested a systematic attempt to erase specific information about events in 1879. Combined with the professor's research into the ghost who never existed, it painted a picture of a deception that had been carefully maintained across generations. Her encounter with Mr. Blacklock that evening proved particularly illuminating. She found him walking in his garden with the studied casualness of someone who had been expecting her visit. His explanation about admiring the evening air rang hollow, particularly when she noticed his quick glance toward the house's upper windows. "I understand you received a parcel from London recently," Miss Marple mentioned with gentle curiosity. Mrs. Hartwell mentioned it came from a Bond Street establishment. Blacklock's composure slipped almost imperceptibly. "A small family matter," he replied carefully. "I had some jewelry appraised for insurance purposes." "How prudent," Miss Marple observed, "particularly for pieces with historical significance. The Shawcross family crest featured a swallow, I believe." The reaction was immediate and telling. Blacklock's hand tightened on his walking stick, and a muscle twitched in his jaw. "I wouldn't know about family crests," he said with forced lightness. "I'm afraid local history has never been my particular interest." Walking home through the gathering dusk, Miss Marple reflected on the day's discoveries. The evidence suggested a carefully orchestrated plan involving multiple deceptions. Someone had borrowed Griselda's identity through the brooch and hat, established credibility as the mysterious Mrs. Gray through an earlier visit, and lured Professor Wainwright to his death with the promise of crucial evidence. The appointment at 4 o'clock in the summer house had been timed perfectly, when the fete was at its busiest and temporary absences would go unnoticed. The professor had expected to receive proof about the Shawcross mystery, and instead encountered something that challenged his fundamental understanding of the case. Most intriguingly, the instruction to bring brooch suggested that the professor possessed something, perhaps Griselda's ancestral brooch or evidence related to it, that was crucial to the mystery. The killer had needed both to silence the professor and to retrieve whatever evidence he carried. As she reached her garden gate, Miss Marple sensed that the peaceful village of St. Mary Mead was about to yield secrets that had been buried for far too long. The ghost who never existed was becoming increasingly real, and the truth behind the Shawcross deception was finally beginning to emerge from decades of carefully maintained lies. The following morning brought an escalation that transformed Professor Wainwright's death from an isolated tragedy into something far more sinister. Miss Marple awoke to the acrid smell of smoke drifting through her cottage windows, and by the time she had dressed and ventured outside, a small crowd had gathered near the churchyard. The vestry window showed signs of forced entry, and within the stone chamber, the iron stove contained the smouldering remains of what had once been parish registers. Reverend Clement stood beside Inspector Slack, his face pale with distress as they examined the charred fragments. The fire had been deliberately set, targeting specific volumes with surgical precision. The registers for 1878 through 1880 had been torn from their bindings and fed to the flames, though the destruction had been incomplete enough to leave tantalizing scraps of evidence among the ashes. Miss Marple approached with a basket of scones, offering comfort while positioning herself to observe the inspector's investigation. A fragment of grey netting clung to the forced window latch, so fine it might have been mistaken for cobweb, yet the texture was distinctly that of a veil. More significantly, beneath the smoke and ash lingered the faint but unmistakable scent of bergamot and jasmine, the same perfume Dr. Haydock had detected on Professor Wainwright's clothing. Someone knew exactly what they wanted destroyed, Inspector Slack observed grimly, using his penknife to separate the burned fragments. The years surrounding the Shawcross disappearance, specifically. This wasn't random vandalism. Mrs. Finch arrived at the scene in a state of considerable agitation, having discovered that Professor Wainwright's cottage had been searched during the night. The intruder had moved through the rooms with professional efficiency, targeting the professor's research materials with the same precision that had characterized the vestry fire. "She came back," Mrs. Finch whispered to Miss Marple, her hands trembling as she described the grey-clad figure who had rifled through the professor's papers. The same lady who visited him before his death. She knew exactly where everything was kept, as if she had been watching him work for weeks. The systematic destruction of evidence suggested that Professor Wainwright's death had not resolved the killer's concerns, but had instead created new urgencies. Someone was clearly attempting to eliminate all traces of his research into the Shawcross family mystery, yet their very desperation indicated that crucial evidence remained beyond their reach. Miss Marple's afternoon visit to the vicarage provided another piece of this increasingly complex puzzle. She found Griselda Clement in the garden shed, her face flushed with excitement and terror as she held a small wooden box that had been hidden behind dusty flower pots. "I found this after you mentioned my grandmother's brooch yesterday," Griselda explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was tucked away where no one would think to look, wrapped in oiled cloth to protect it from moisture." Inside the box, nestled on faded velvet, lay a silver swallow brooch identical to the one Griselda typically wore, yet unmistakably older. The silver had acquired the deep patina of age, and the craftsmanship showed the meticulous attention to detail characteristic of Victorian jewelry. Pinned beneath the brooch was a piece of paper covered in spidery handwriting, the ink brown with age. "It's from my great-grandmother," Griselda continued, her voice gaining strength. "She writes about a promise made to the Shawcross family, something about protecting a secret and ensuring that the truth would never come to light. She mentions that there were 2 brooches, one for the living and one for the dead." This revelation cast Professor Wainwright's final message in an entirely different light. The instruction to bring brooch had not referred to Griselda's everyday jewelry, but to this hidden family heirloom that held the key to the Shawcross deception. The professor had somehow discovered the existence of this second brooch and arranged to examine it, believing it would provide the final proof for his theory about the ghost who never existed. Miss Marple's encounter with Mr. Blacklock that evening proved equally illuminating. She found him in his garden, burning papers with methodical determination, the flames casting dancing shadows across his increasingly haggard features. His explanation about spring cleaning rang hollow, particularly when she noticed fragments of legal documents and correspondence among the ashes. "I understand you've had visitors from London recently," Miss Marple mentioned conversationally, having observed an unfamiliar carriage departing from Dyas Hall earlier that afternoon. Blacklock's composure slipped almost imperceptibly. "Business associates," he replied carefully. "Matters relating to property and inheritance can be quite complex, particularly when dealing with historical claims." The phrase "historical claims" struck Miss Marple as particularly significant. Combined with the systematic destruction of evidence and the desperate search for the hidden brooch, it suggested that someone's legal right to Dyas Hall itself might be threatened by Professor Wainwright's research. As she walked home through the gathering dusk, Miss Marple reflected on the day's revelations. The existence of two identical brooches, one worn openly, one hidden for generations, suggested a deception that extended far beyond a simple disappearance in 1879. The careful destruction of parish records and the professor's research indicated that someone with detailed knowledge of the original crime was still alive and actively protecting their secrets. Most disturbing was the realization that the Grey Lady was not a supernatural apparition, but a carefully constructed identity, someone who moved through the village with confidence born of intimate familiarity. The scents of bergamot and jasmine at the vestry, combined with the violet sachets mentioned in various notes, suggested either multiple conspirators or a single person skilled in creating different personas through carefully chosen fragrances. The professor's death had been merely the opening move in a deadly game that threatened to claim additional victims before the truth could be revealed. Miss Marple pulled her shawl closer as she reached her garden gate, sensing that the peaceful village of St. Mary Mead was about to yield its most carefully guarded secret, one that someone had already killed to protect, and would undoubtedly kill again to preserve. The morning brought a development that transformed the investigation from academic inquiry into immediate legal peril. Miss Marple, arriving at the post office with her customary punctuality, observed Mr. Blacklock's receipt of a registered letter bearing the distinctive seal of Lincoln's Inn. His composed demeanor cracked almost imperceptibly as he read, and his immediate request for both a telegram to London and a messenger to Much Benham carried the urgency of a man whose carefully constructed world was beginning to collapse. Mrs. Hartwell, with the discretion that made her an invaluable source of village intelligence, confided that the letter had contained phrases such as adverse claim pending and preliminary notice of intent, legal terminology that suggested Professor Wainwright's research had uncovered evidence threatening Blacklock's very ownership of Dyas Hall. Miss Marple's subsequent visit to the vicarage revealed the most significant breakthrough yet in unraveling the Shawcross mystery. Griselda, still trembling from her discovery of the hidden brooch, had made an additional finding that cast the entire case in startling new light. The antique silver swallow, when examined more closely in proper daylight, revealed a tiny engraving on its reverse side, a single initial A worked into the decorative pattern with such subtlety that it might easily have been overlooked. More dramatically still, Miss Marple's gentle manipulation of the brooch's construction revealed what Griselda had not yet discovered. The swallow's body contained a hidden compartment accessible through a nearly invisible hinge mechanism. Within lay a miniature portrait scarcely larger than a postage stamp, depicting a young woman with serious eyes and delicate features, wearing a dress with modest grey trim and, at her throat, a swallow brooch identical to the one in Miss Marple's hands. "The living and the dead," Miss Marple murmured, studying the portrait with characteristic intensity. "Your great-grandmother's note mentioned 2 brooches, one for each state of being. This suggests that Annabel Shawcross did not simply disappear, but that her fate was deliberately obscured through the creation of a false identity." The implications struck Griselda with visible force. "You mean she assumed another name? Lived secretly while allowing the world to believe her dead? Or Miss Marple replied thoughtfully. Someone else assumed her identity after her actual death, using the Grey Lady legend to explain occasional appearances while maintaining the fiction of her disappearance. This theory gained support from Mrs. Finch's afternoon visit, during which the professor's former housekeeper revealed additional details about the mysterious scents that had plagued the investigation. Her careful observation had detected not one but two distinct fragrances associated with the Grey Lady appearances: the sharp bergamot and jasmine found at the crime scenes, and the softer violet, sachets mentioned in various notes. "It suggests either two different women," Miss Marple observed, "or one person deliberately creating multiple identities through carefully chosen perfumes. The bergamot and jasmine represents the active, dangerous presence, the one who killed Professor Wainwright and burned the vestry records. The violet sachets suggest someone older, more traditional, perhaps operating from a position of established respectability." The afternoon brought a dramatic development that seemed to confirm the supernatural elements the villagers had long whispered about. A figure in grey appeared on the upper balcony of Dias Hall just as the sun began its descent behind the elms, visible to a dozen pairs of eyes across the village green. The apparition lifted a white-gloved hand in what might have been greeting or warning before vanishing into the house's shadowed interior. Inspector Slack's immediate investigation of the phenomenon revealed its thoroughly earthly origins. The balcony door showed signs of recent use, and a spare bedroom contained the props necessary for the deception: a dressmaker's dummy draped in grey silk, a hat pinned with fine netting, and an atomizer that released the telltale scent of violet sachets when pressed. Most tellingly, the balcony rail bore traces of beeswax polish and a tiny fragment of green paint scraped from the trellis below, while the floorboards showed the narrow footprint of someone wearing city shoes rather than country boots. Mr. Blacklock's explanation that unknown parties had entered his house rang hollow, particularly when combined with his obvious nervousness and his insistence that nothing had been taken. Miss Marple noted how his gaze lingered on the costume props with the familiarity of someone who had arranged them personally. The day's final revelation came from Mrs. Finch's discovery of a partially burned document fragment that had escaped the vestry fire. The scrap, caught beneath the stove leg, showed the distinctive handwriting of a Victorian parish clerk recording what appeared to be a private baptism performed at home for a female child. The date placed it precisely between the altered baptism of Annabel S. and the mysterious burial of an unnamed infant weeks later. Most significantly, a marginal note referenced additional documentation in The Rector's Book, a volume that no longer existed in the current parish records. As evening approached, Miss Marple reflected on the pattern that was emerging from the accumulated evidence. The systematic destruction of records, the staged ghost appearances, and the legal threats to Blacklock's property ownership all pointed to a deception that had been carefully maintained across generations. Someone with intimate knowledge of the original 1879 events was still alive and actively protecting secrets that could destroy not only reputations, but substantial financial interests. The existence of two identical brooches, one worn openly, one hidden for decades, suggested that the Shawcross mystery involved not just a disappearance, but a deliberate substitution of identities. The ghost who never existed was becoming increasingly real, and the truth behind the deception was finally beginning to emerge from its carefully constructed shadows. Miss Marple settled her shawl more securely as she prepared for what she sensed would be the investigation's crucial phase. The killer, feeling increasingly cornered by the mounting evidence, would soon be forced to make a desperate move that would finally reveal the truth behind nearly half a century of carefully maintained lies. The morning's legal correspondence had clearly unsettled Mr. Blacklock's carefully maintained composure, and Miss Marple recognized that desperate men often revealed their truest selves when pressed beyond endurance. She decided that the time for subtle observation had passed, and that a more direct application of pressure would yield the final pieces of this increasingly complex puzzle. Under the pretext of discussing arrangements for the annual church flower show, she requested an afternoon visit to Dias Hall, knowing that such social obligations could not be refused without appearing churlish. Blacklock received her in the drawing room with practiced courtesy that barely concealed his underlying tension. His movements carried the careful precision of someone fighting to maintain control, and Miss Marple noted how his eyes repeatedly darted toward the windows as if expecting unwelcome visitors. The room itself felt more like a museum than a home, elegant but sterile, lacking the comfortable accumulation of personal history that characterized genuine family residences. "Such a lovely afternoon for calling," Miss Marple began, settling into her chair with the deceptive frailty that often lulled suspects into underestimating her perceptiveness. "Though I confess I've been quite preoccupied with poor Professor Wainwright's research. Such a dedicated scholar, always so fascinated by our local history and the curious inconsistencies he kept discovering." She withdrew the antique swallow brooch from her reticule, placing it carefully on the small table between them. The silver caught the afternoon light with a dull gleam that seemed to draw Blacklock's attention like a magnet. Griselda Clement found this among her grandmother's papers, along with the most intriguing family correspondence. It appears there were always two brooches, you see, one for the living and one for the dead, as her great-grandmother so poetically expressed it. Blacklock's grip on his teacup tightened almost imperceptibly, his knuckles whitening as he struggled to maintain his composure. "Family heirlooms often carry sentimental significance beyond their actual value," he replied with forced lightness, "though I'm not certain how this relates to the unfortunate professor's death." "Oh, but it relates quite directly," Miss Marple continued with gentle persistence. "Professor Wainwright had discovered that this brooch contains a hidden compartment, and within it a miniature portrait of someone who should not exist according to the official records. The young woman bears a remarkable resemblance to the Shawcross family portraits, yet she's wearing this very brooch in the painting. It suggests that Annabel Shawcross did not simply disappear, but that someone else assumed her identity while she lived on under a different name." The reaction was immediate and telling. Blacklock's hand trembled as he set down his cup, the china rattling against the saucer with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet room. His eyes fixed on the brooch with the intensity of someone seeing a ghost made manifest. "The professor's theory," Miss Marple continued, her voice maintaining its conversational tone while her eyes remained fixed on Blacklock's face, "was that the Grey Lady legend served a very practical purpose. It explained away any inconvenient sightings of someone who was supposed to be dead while allowing the true heir to the Shawcross fortune to be quietly eliminated from succession. Your family's claim to Dias Hall, Mr. Blacklock, depends entirely upon Annabel Shawcross having died without issue in 1879. Blacklock rose abruptly, pacing to the window with movements that betrayed his growing agitation. "These are dangerous speculations, Miss Marple. Old families often have complex histories, but that doesn't justify wild theories based on jewelry and portraits." "Indeed not," she agreed pleasantly. "But then there are the parish records that someone took such care to destroy, and the rector's private memoranda that Professor Wainwright had located. They documented a private baptism in June 1879, suggesting that Annabel Shawcross had given birth to a child whose very existence would invalidate your family's inheritance." She paused, allowing the implications to settle before continuing with devastating gentleness. "The professor arranged to meet someone at the summer house, someone he believed could provide final proof of his theory. Instead, he encountered his killer, someone who knew exactly how to manipulate the Grey Lady legend to move unseen through the village, someone with intimate knowledge of both the original deception and the current legal vulnerabilities it created." Blacklock's facade was cracking visibly now, the urbane gentleman replaced by a man under unbearable pressure. His hands shook as he gripped the window frame, and when he turned back to face her, his eyes held the desperate calculation of a cornered animal. "The staged appearance on your balcony was particularly clever. Miss Marple observed with professional admiration, using the Grey Lady legend to create witnesses while establishing your apparent innocence. But the beeswax polish on the rail and the city shoes in the spare bedroom rather gave the game away. You've been playing both parts, haven't you, Mr. Blacklock, the respectable gentleman and the mysterious Grey Lady, using different perfumes to create distinct identities? The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, broken only by the steady tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Blacklock's composure had finally shattered completely, revealing the desperate man beneath the carefully constructed persona. His eyes moved from the brooch to Miss Marple's face, searching for some escape from the trap that had closed around him with inexorable precision. Professor Wainwright came very close to exposing everything, didn't he? Miss Marple asked softly. The false identity, the forged records, the murdered heir whose death allowed your family to claim Dias Hall. And you realized that his research would destroy not only your fortune, but your very freedom. The confrontation had reached its crucial moment, and Miss Marple settled back in her chair, prepared for the confession that would finally illuminate the truth behind nearly half a century of carefully maintained deception. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire until Blacklock's carefully maintained facade finally shattered completely. He sank into his chair with the weight of a man who had carried an unbearable secret across generations, his hands trembling as he reached for the brandy decanter with desperate need. "You understand nothing of what it means," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the relentless ticking of the grandfather clock. "To discover that everything you are, everything you possess, was built upon a deception so profound that it reaches back through decades of carefully maintained lies." Miss Marple waited with the patience of someone who had learned that truth emerged most completely when given space to breathe. The antique swallow brooch seemed to draw Blacklock's gaze like a magnet, its silver surface reflecting the afternoon light with an almost accusatory gleam. Professor Wainwright had discovered something that went far beyond a simple disappearance, Blacklock continued, his voice gaining the hollow tone of complete defeat. The Shawcross family secret was not that Annabel had vanished, but that she had never existed as the world believed her to be. The story that emerged was more complex and tragic than even Miss Marple had initially suspected. The Shawcross family had indeed produced twin daughters in 1859, but Agnes had been born with a slight physical deformity that the family considered a blemish on their social standing. While Annabel grew up in the public eye as the beautiful, accomplished heir, Agnes had been kept hidden, raised in seclusion by trusted servants, and presented to the world only as a distant cousin when absolutely necessary. When Annabel became pregnant by the gardener in 1879, Blacklock explained, his hands shaking as he poured himself a generous measure of brandy, the family saw an opportunity to resolve multiple problems simultaneously. They sent Annabel away for a secret confinement, but instead of allowing her to return with the child, they convinced Agnes to take her sister's place permanently. The deception had been breathtakingly audacious. Agnes, desperate for acceptance and the love that had been denied her throughout her hidden childhood, had agreed to assume her sister's identity completely. She married the man chosen for Annabel, bore his children, and lived out her entire adult life as someone else. Meanwhile, the real Annabel had been quietly eliminated from the family's history, her fate obscured by carefully altered parish records and the deliberate cultivation of the Grey Lady legend. "The child born to the real Annabel," Miss Marple observed gently, "was your great-grandmother, wasn't it, Mr. Blacklock? The true heir to the Shawcross fortune, raised in obscurity while Agnes lived the life that should have belonged to Annabel's descendants." Blacklock nodded miserably, his composure completely destroyed. "My family had served as estate managers for generations, trusted with the Shawcross secrets and business affairs. When Agnes died without revealing the truth, my grandfather gradually assumed ownership of Dias Hall, believing that no legitimate heir existed to challenge the claim. The two identical brooches had been created as symbols of this terrible deception. One for Agnes to wear publicly as the false Annabel, and one hidden away as a memorial to the real Annabel and her murdered child's rightful inheritance. The miniature portrait concealed within the hidden brooch showed not Annabel as the world had known her, but the real Annabel as she had appeared during her final months, wearing the grey dress that would later inspire the Grey Lady legend. Professor Wainwright had traced the London family that had raised Annabel's child. Blacklock continued, his voice now carrying the flat tone of complete confession. He had found marriage certificates, birth records, death certificates spanning 4 generations. More importantly, he had located living descendants with legitimate claims to everything my family had built upon their stolen inheritance. The professor's meeting at the summer house had been arranged under false pretenses. Blacklock had used the Grey Lady disguise to lure him there, hoping to reason with him or perhaps arrange some sort of financial settlement. But when Professor Wainwright saw him in the costume, and when he realized the full implications of the deception and Blacklock's desperate attempt to maintain it, the shock had proven too much for his heart. "I never intended murder," Blacklock whispered, tears streaming down his face. I had hoped to convince him that exposing the truth would harm innocent people, that some secrets were better left buried. But when he saw me as the Grey Lady, when he understood that I was the living embodiment of the very deception he was investigating, the terror was too great for him to bear. The systematic destruction of evidence that had followed, the vestry fire, the search of the professor's cottage, the staged balcony appearance, had been panic responses rather than carefully planned crimes. The legal letter Blacklock had received contained preliminary notices from Professor Wainwright's solicitors, who had already begun the process of establishing the legitimate heir's claims before his death. The sound of approaching footsteps on the gravel drive announced Inspector Slack's arrival, summoned by Miss Marple's earlier message. As the inspector entered the drawing room with 2 constables, Blacklock made no attempt to deny his guilt or construct additional deceptions. The weight of nearly half a century of lies had finally become unbearable. "The ghost who never existed," Miss Marple murmured as Inspector Slack began the formal procedures of arrest, "was actually the truth that was never allowed to live. The real Annabel Shawcross died as she had lived in her final months, quietly and without recognition, but her daughter's legitimate claim to the family fortune was buried along with her." As Blacklock was led away, his shoulders bowed with the weight of inherited guilt and personal responsibility, Miss Marple reflected on the tragedy that had unfolded across 4 generations. A family's desperate attempt to maintain social respectability had created a web of deception so complex that it had ultimately destroyed everyone it was meant to protect. The afternoon sun was setting behind the elms as Miss Marple walked home through the village green, where the peaceful routines of St. Mary Mead were already beginning to reassert themselves. The news of Blacklock's arrest and the true Shawcross deception would provide conversation for months to come, but the village would gradually return to its customary tranquility. At her garden gate, she paused to consider the antique swallow brooch still secured in her reticule. Tomorrow, she would arrange for it to be returned to London, where Professor Wainwright's solicitors would ensure it reached the rightful heirs, the great-great-grandchildren of the real Annabel Shawcross, who would finally receive the inheritance that had been stolen from their family nearly 50 years earlier. The living and the dead would at last be properly honored, and the ghost who never existed could rest in the truth that had been so long denied. Miss Marple adjusted her shawl against the evening chill, reflecting once again on the intricate patterns of human nature and the inevitable way that buried secrets, like bulbs planted in darkness, eventually found their way to the light.